Okay, so um, I'm going to start by talking about power, which I didn't get to at the end last time. So, all right. Erase all this crap left over from last time. I'm going to talk about power. Uh, hmm. So the idea of power is kind of an odd idea. Um, because in general, what is an idea the idea of? An idea is the idea of the quality that causes it. At least that's the right way to look at it. So, again, here's the mind, here's the operation, in the simplest case anyway, the operation of perception. Here's the idea. And then the idea refers to or represents the quality of some external thing. And this quality, what is it? Well, it's the power to cause this perception. So I always draw this line of causality this way. Right? This external object, this is causality. This external object causes me to perceive this idea, whether I want to perceive it or not. And again, that's the first mental operation. Of course, after that, I do all kinds of other things with ideas, but this is what the idea is the idea of. It's the idea of the quality that could cause me to perceive it. And the quality that could cause me to perceive it is a power. Right? Now, in the case of a primary quality, there's that power somehow is like a separable part or aspect of the external object. In the case of a secondary quality, it's merely a power, it's a bare power. That is, there isn't really a separate um, part or structural element of the external object that is the power. Um, but nevertheless, in both cases, whenever there's a simple idea here, it refers to the power to cause me to perceive that idea. But now we're supposed to have, so like if this is in the case of a secondary quality, let's say this is the quality of redness. And this is the idea of red. I should say. This is the quality of redness. The quality of redness is the power to cause me to perceive the idea of red. Um, So I hope you can already start to say, doesn't that seem a bit circular? Doesn't what seem a bit circular? Oh, the idea that the redness would cause the idea of red after having the idea of red. No, no, the point is the quality we call redness in the external object, that is the whatever it is in the external object, which my idea is actually idea of, is the power to cause me to perceive that idea. So maybe like to put it the other way around, when I have this simple idea, which as Locke keeps emphasizing, I didn't cause myself. I can't make my own simple ideas, never mind how we know that exactly. So, I have this simple idea. I didn't cause it myself. Um, some other object had the power to cause it in me. And I use the idea to stand for that power that external thing had to cause this perception of this idea in me. It's a specific distinction. All right, that maybe that's not exactly the right way to say it, but I think you get the idea now anyway. All right. So, but now you see the weird thing about this, because now we're bringing in something else called the idea of power. Oops, this is still no good. So now we're bringing in something else called the idea of power. So, I mean, presumably that doesn't mean that there's another power here, the power to cause the idea of power. I didn't really leave enough room for me to draw this here, but um, right? I mean, we don't want to say that there's another kind of quality of power in the object, namely the power to cause in me the idea of power. And that when I think of a power, I'm thinking of this idea of power that's caused by this other power. That's I don't know how to explain why that's. I don't know how to say clearly why that seems like it couldn't be what Locke means, but it's just like there's one power too many here. Every idea is the idea of power, right? That is, every idea is the idea of the power to cause that idea. We don't need another idea to cause the idea of power. There's another power to cause the idea of power. I mean, I don't know whether to say that would be circular or would lead to a regress, or anyway, it's just would be bad. So, um, so I think instead, although Locke doesn't exactly say this, the idea of power is another one of these ideas, like the idea of unity and the idea of existence, that comes in with every simple idea. I guess you could say indeed with every idea, because in the case of every idea, there was a power either in an external thing or in my own mind to, um, oh, that's what you meant. Oh, okay, that's what I'm talking about then, right. So there is an idea either in me, or, I mean, so there's a power either in an external thing or in my own mind to cause that idea. And therefore, it seems like every idea must involve the idea of power. Um, so, so actually, there's kind of a list of these ideas now: unity, existence, limit, I guess. Right? These are the two that Locke mentions. These are the ones that I'm bringing in to explain him: power, and maybe we should also add substance. Now, why do I say we should also add substance? I mean, Locke sometimes says we have no idea of substance. Sometimes he says we have only a confused, obscure, relative idea of substance. Um, um, I think it's in the second case. He's being more precise. We have an idea of substance, but it's not a clear, distinct positive idea. It's a confused, obscure, relative idea. So, but that, and I think the idea that's confused and obscure, I'm not sure about this. I think the idea that's confused and obscure is the idea of substance in general. Maybe he means the idea of an individual type of substance is also always confused and obscure. But in any case, the main thing about the idea of substance in general is that it's relative. We only know it as the support of certain qualities. But we don't know what it itself is. Right? That is, we don't know what substance is in itself, where again, considering something in itself just means considering it absolutely or positively, that is not relative to something else. So we don't know what substances are. Well, we don't know at least what substance is in itself. We only know how it's related to qualities. But as related to qualities, and so this is why I'm suggesting that it comes in with every idea, so to speak. So this is from the chapter on power, actually, when he's starting to discuss freedom of the will. But what he says here is important to understand what he means about substance. So, book 2, chapter 21, section 16. Who is it that sees not that powers belong only to agents and are attributes only of substances and not of powers themselves? Right? So, what he's saying there is that it somehow is included in the idea of power. So we have an idea of power, right? This thing, in which I'm saying comes in with every idea. We have an idea of power, but somehow included in the idea of power is that a power is not a thing on its own, but is an attribute of something else, and that something else is what we call a substance. And in general, the power is not a thing at all. So if we look in section 6, these powers of the mind, to wit, of perceiving, of preferring, and of preferring, are usually called by another name, and the ordinary way of speaking is that the understanding and will are two faculties of the mind, a word proper enough if it be used as all words should be, so as not to breed any confusion in men's thoughts by being supposed, as I suspect it has been, to stand for some real beings in the soul that performed those actions of understanding and volition. Right? So, what he's saying there, and it's leading up to his discussion of freedom of will, which I'm going to get back to, but now I'm interested in the metaphysical content of this. What he's saying there is that a mistake we make about some of the powers of our own mind, for example, the power of understanding, the power of perceiving, the power of preferring, choosing, is that we tend to think those powers are real beings. Right? Some real beings in the soul. Soul and mind are interchangeable here, I think. So we tend to think that there's some real beings in the soul, whereas actually it's just a way of talking about the fact that the soul can operate in a certain way. For example, can have this operation of perception or whatever, other operations. And that is, oh, sorry, I'm pointing to the board when you can't see the board. Let me switch back. Now, this. That's better. Right? So what I was saying is, we make a mistake of thinking that in addition to the mind and its operations, there are also these things called faculties or powers of the mind, like the power of perception. And Locke says it's perfectly okay to say that the mind has a power of perception, but you have to keep in mind that the power of perception isn't some real being in the mind. It's just a way of talking about the mind itself insofar as it can have this operation of perception. So remember, that was the same thing he said about secondary qualities, that we, at least as I understood him, he said that our mistake in thinking that secondary qualities are really in the object or that they resemble our ideas is the same kind of mistake. Yes, there is a power in the object to cause me to perceive the idea of redness. And if I want, I can call that power the quality of redness. Just as like, if I want, I can call this power the faculty of perception. But if I get misled into thinking there's a real being in the external object called redness, then I'm making a mistake, just as I would be if I get led into thinking there's a real being in the mind, the faculty of perception. So it seems like, in general, his view about powers is that they don't, or at least don't necessarily involve any real being, anything. In general, they're saying that there is a power is a way of is just a way of saying that something can operate in a certain way, and that something that can operate in that certain way is the substance. And so that's why I say that relative idea of substance as like whatever it is. Oh, here comes Alana. She was saying before this that she couldn't wait till my students could see her. And then she said, they should see me in a crown. All right. Anyway, the chat window back here. All right. Um, so in the case of primary qualities, maybe things are a little bit different because there is a real being, or at least a real aspect of the structure of some being that is the power. And that has something to do with Locke saying that if we knew the structure, the bulk, figure, position, and motions of the small parts of external things, such as of gold, for example, we would know what they really are. We would know the essence as substances. But since Locke says we don't know that, and we never will know that because they're too small, that's what Locke says. Now, a question is that what happened? Now we do know it? And therefore, when we say something is gold, we don't mean it's yellow and ductile and all that stuff. We mean that it consists of atoms with a certain number of electrons. And is that description consist of primary qualities, or what we should call primary qualities? I don't know. It's complicated because of quantum mechanics. It's so screwy, but you might think something like that. But anyway, so Locke says we won't ever know that. Oops, page 2 didn't print out for some reason, but that's okay. I have it on my screen. Okay, so anyway, so that's why I might be tempted to include power and substance in this list and say that in fact they always come in as correlatives with every idea, right? That is, with every idea comes in, this maybe is what Locke means when he starts complaining that the idea of power has something relative in it. These two ideas come in as correlatives with every idea. And they come in, so we don't really know what either of them is in general. And in specific cases, we would know what each of them is specifically, like what the substance and powers of gold are, if we knew the primary qualities of the small parts of gold, but we don't. So what do we know about the power and substance of gold? And again, those two things go together because like the powers of gold are just whatever the substance of gold can do. And the substance of gold is just whatever can do those things. So those two things to go together. And again, I think Locke admits from the beginning that the only thing we observe in either of those cases is the constant conjunction of secondary qualities. And again, that's going to be important when we try to understand what Hume's criticism of Locke is and what and how or exactly where it hits Locke's argument, or if it really hits Locke's argument. Right? So all we actually observe is that certain ideas of secondary qualities come either together or one after another. But it's actually, I mean, one after another is kind of secondary. I mean, it's, you know, it's one after another is a way of saying that the same thing that had the power to cause this idea also has the power to cause that idea, either directly or indirectly. The sun has the power to cause light and heat in me, and also has the power to get me to perceive wax as whitened. To use one of Locke's examples, which is also Descartes' example and probably older than that. Well, I'm not sure I've seen it in older people, but anyway, a lump of wax is a very common example, I think because it was the kind of thing that you typically had sitting around on your desk as you were working. Either because you were using candles to light your desk or because you were using it as sealing wax. So, right, anyway, be that as it may. So I mean, what's really involved in both of these is the thought of certain powers, the powers to cause the ideas of certain secondary qualities as being necessarily connected in something else that has those powers. But Locke says, all we ever observe, or all we typically observe, because these are always secondary qualities, is just that these things always go together. We don't actually perceive the intent, the necessity that we intend in our idea. Okay, that's all I want to say about power and substance, at least for now. Are there questions about that? Because now I'm going to go on to something not unrelated, but different. Okay, so let me erase all of this. And what I'm going to talk about now, so there are a number of, there's a group of things that go together here, which I'm going to discuss together one after, I'm going to discuss first one after the other. So, oops. How did I get to? There we go. Okay, so freedom of will, morality, and personal identity. So, I mean, Locke distributes his discussion of these topics into three different places. This one goes in the chapter on power. This one goes in the chapter on identity and difference. And this one goes in the chapter on quote unquote other relations. But these are all the pieces of Locke's ethics and politics as discussed in the essay. Now, I mean, Locke has other works, especially the ones we read in 144, where he talks more directly about ethics and politics. And what he says there is similar, although even though these books were written about the same time, not obviously exactly the same. But anyway, in the essay, this is where he talks about it. Why does he distribute it this way in these kind of obscure places? And especially this one is kind of like hidden in the middle of a chapter that sounds boring because it's called Other Relations. And then it starts off really boring because the relations he talks about are like, for example, the relation for any simple idea, you can form the relation of, or for certain simple ideas, you can form the relation of having that more. So like for red, you can form the idea of redder. And then he discusses natural relations like father and son and whatever. And this is like, okay, relations. And then all of a sudden he introduces his theory of morality right in the middle of that. Possibly, I wouldn't want to bet on this too hard, but possibly this is a technique that Locke is using to like actually divert certain kinds of readers from thinking about this stuff too hard, or even from getting to it, right? Like certain type of readers will start that chapter and not finish it. That's a kind of Straussian explanation of Locke's technique here. If you don't know what that means, never mind. I'm going to go on to talk about other stuff. So anyway, that's the first thing I want to talk about. Then, although as usual, this may be optimistic. I want to talk about adequate and inadequate ideas. Also clear and obscure and distinct and confused, but this is probably the most important one, adequate versus inadequate. And then finally, I want to talk about association of ideas. Which Locke also calls madness. All right. So this one first, and first of all, starting with this part, freedom of the will. Okay, so I guess I'm going to erase this list now since I don't have room to write other stuff in the board. So Locke defines freedom or liberty, right? That's just the same thing in English or Latin, basically. Freedom or liberty. He defines it as a power, and it's the power to do or not do some action depending on my preference, that is, on my will, because he also defines the will as the power to prefer one thing rather than another. So there's two different powers here. One power is the power called the power. One power is called the will, and that's the power to prefer one thing or another, given alternatives. And there's another power which is called freedom or liberty, and that's the power to do or not do something depending on whether I prefer to do it or prefer not to do it. And so Locke's first response to the question of freedom of will, which he puts this way, is the will free? He says, his first response to it is, well, that's just not a good question. So let me return to the document camera here. And back around where I was before. Let's see all these things at once now. Page 225. For if I mistake not, it follows from what I have said that the question itself is altogether improper, and it is as insignificant to ask whether man's will be free as to ask whether his sleep be swift or his virtue square. Right? He's saying it's a bad question because the will isn't even the kind of thing that could be free or not free. What's the opposite of free? The opposite of free is necessitated, that is constrained, right? If I'm not free, it means that I have to do something whether I prefer to do it or not. So the will is not the kind of thing that could be free or constrained, necessitated, Locke is saying. And this is where the passage I read before comes in. Why is the will not the right kind of thing? Because as I just said, Locke says, this is one power, and this is another power, and powers don't have powers. Substances have powers. So when I ask, is the will free? It's like asking, can the power to sing dance? And the answer is no, powers can't dance, people can dance, right? So a person can have the power to sing and the power to dance, but the power to sing itself can't have the power to dance. Locke says that doesn't make any sense. Therefore, this question, is the will free, doesn't make any sense. Um, now, problem is the share screen is not a regular window. Maybe it is. Okay, I don't know. So the question is, however, how relevant is that answer? I mean, it's a correct answer from Locke's point of view, but it seems like it's kind of unfair in that what it really just means is we didn't phrase the question right. That is the will free is not the question we meant to ask, because that question doesn't make any sense. But there was a question we meant to ask, right? We should have said something about the person being free. What were we trying to ask about the person being free? And it's more or less clear what we meant to ask about the person being free, because although the will is a power, the will, like any other power, has its acts, its operations. The will is the power to do certain things, that is, to have certain operations in your mind. And those operations are called volitions. So oh, wait, I need to share the screen so you can see what I'm doing. Right, so here's the mind. Here's the will. It's this dotted circle here. And the will is a power. And so Locke says the will can't be free because the will isn't the kind of thing that can be free. Okay, fine, but the will is the power to have certain kinds of operations. So here's an operation. Normally we would call that that operation is called volition. Normally we would call that an operation of the will. So I think, again, in line with Locke's stricter way of speaking, maybe we should say it's an operation of the mind insofar as the mind has the power that we call will, right? It's really not the will that has operations. It's really the mind that has operations, but it has it in virtue of its powers, for example, the will, right? So this is something that I could either do or not do. And so it makes perfect sense to ask, am I free to have this volition? Right? Just as it makes sense to ask, am I free to stop walking when I'm walking, to use one of Locke's examples. And if the answer is yes, that would mean that if I prefer to keep walking, I will keep walking because of my preference. I'm not sure if that adds something, but anyway, let's put that in. Whereas if I prefer to stop walking, then I will stop because of my preference. So similarly here, if we ask, am I free to have this volition? The question would be, if I prefer not to have that volition, will I not have it because of my preference? And if I prefer to have that volition, will I have it because of my preference? And if the answer in both cases is yes, then I'm free to have that volition. I think that's the way Locke defines it. So whenever you're free to do something, you're always free not to do it also. Now saying that, I'm not sure that he consistently defines it that way. But in any case, if both the answer to both of those is yes, then I'm certainly free to have this volition or not. So in other words, the question we should have asked, okay, Locke, strictly speaking, this was the question. Are we free in willing? Is the action of willing or volition a free act? Okay, so do people understand where I am so far? Are there any questions? Guess not. All right. So, so sure enough, Locke does go on to discuss those questions, that question, namely the one we actually wanted to ask, namely, not is the will free, but are we free in willing? Is volition free? And he asks it actually in two different ways, which may be a little bit confusing, actually. So the first one, which he asks in section 23, right, yes, what can I erase here? Nothing really. I'll just try to write it in small here and I hope you can see it. So there's two ways he asks the question. One is in section 23 and the other is in section 25. So the way he asks the question in section 23 is, what that says is, will this or will nothing? That is, he takes the two alternatives that I want to know whether I can do based on my preference as having a certain volition or having no volition, right? So like, for example, in the case of the person who's walking and they will to stop walking, and we want to know, was that free? So the question then is going to be, so there's already something confusing about this, right? We're not asking whether the action of stopping walking was free. That just has to do with whether they stop or not depends on their volition. But now let's suppose they have the volition, the preference to stop walking. And like, forget about whether that actually makes them stop walking or not. That's not even interesting now. The question is whether they were free to have that preference or not. So the volition, the will to stop walking. So in the first way he asked the question in section 23, the alternatives are, I will to stop walking, or I don't will at all. Right, so in section 23, he discusses the question, am I free and willing, from the point of view that what I want to know is, am I free to will or not to will anything? And he says, well, obviously I'm not free to not will anything. Like, for example, if I'm walking, I either have to keep walking or stop. So at least as soon as I think of the question, I have to choose one or the other. Now, whether that's really right or not, I don't know. This is actually an important point, even though this is not the question people usually have in mind when they think about freedom of the will. We haven't got to it yet. But it is an important question because various people like Descartes and the Stoics and the ancient skeptics all agree that what we ought to do, at least in a large range of cases, is suspend our will, not will one alternative or the other. And Locke is saying that's impossible. So that's important, but it's not as important, and therefore I'm not going to say anything more about it as the other question which he discusses, which is right, what I wrote there is will this or will that. Here, the two alternatives are, in the walking example, that let's say I had the volition to stop walking. The alternative is to have the volition to keep on walking, right? And the question is, was I free to either have the volition to stop walking or have the volition to keep on walking? Did which of those volitions I have to itself depend on my volition? So Locke says about that one. So first of all, that I think is as close, at least in Locke's view, in Locke's general system, as we could get to asking the question people really have in mind when they ask about freedom of the will, right? The question is not, does my power to prefer things have a power or something like that, nor is it, am I free to suspend my will and not will anything? The question is, I actually preferred this, but could I have preferred the other if I wanted to prefer the other? And Locke says, I think maybe he says this a little bit more strongly than he should, but like he probably should say something like, not in general. That would be absurd, because if that were true in general of all my volitions, it would be an infinite regress. Right? So like maybe we could get one step in where, and sometimes we do this, I guess, and I think Locke would admit that sometimes we do this, like we think, which would I rather prefer? And then we actually maybe do things to get ourselves to prefer one or the other. But Locke is saying that might go back one or two steps, but it can't always be true, right? If you ask about that preference, the preference I had to prefer walking versus to prefer stopping, that preference itself can't also be free, and so on and so forth, because that means that I'm setting up like an infinite series of wills, one behind the other, each one choosing what the other one is going to will. And I guess you always have to ask when when philosophers make an argument like that, okay, why can't we have an infinite series? I think Locke would say, and at least most early modern philosophers, except Spinoza and Leibniz, maybe. Yeah, well, anyway, a lot of philosophers would agree with him. He would say it can't be an infinite series, because an infinite series, by definition, is one that never gets to its end. And so if it required an infinite series of volitions for me to actually choose anything, maybe he actually doesn't have to make this argument. Maybe he could just say, I'm clearly not conscious of any such infinite series, and I would have to be, because these would all be acts of my mind. But leaving that aside, I think he could say, look, there couldn't be an infinite series because it would never get to its end. That is, if I needed an infinite series of volitions in order to either prefer to walk or stop walking, then I would never prefer anything, because everything would always be at the end of an infinite series, but an infinite series doesn't have an end. So anyway, whether that's what he's thinking or not, he dismisses that as absurd. And so again, note, this is a little tricky. This is the question people actually have in mind when they ask whether we have freedom of will. Only after discussing some rather abstruse questions that are hard to follow, that Locke says that those words could mean, if you take them more strictly, does Locke get to this actual question, which is the one we really had in mind? And so it's easy to miss the fact that Locke's answer to this question is No. Right? We don't have the freedom to will this or will that. Oops, I drew that off the bottom of the part of the board you can see. There it is. That's an exclamation point. No, right? So according to what we actually meant when we asked the question, do we have freedom of will? Locke's answer is no. And then if you ask, okay, Locke, so it's not my will, my power of preference that determines, that is like settles the, right, like before I've willed one or the other, it's so to speak up in the air which one I'm going to will. The will itself, the power of volition I have is general enough that it's a power to will to stop walking and a power to will to keep walking. So the question is like, what settles that unsettled question? Which one am I gonna, which of these operations am I actually gonna carry out? So when we thought the will might be free, the answer was going to be, well, the will itself somehow settles that, but Locke says that would be an infinite regress. So by the way, someone like Kant, or maybe not someone like Kant, but Kant, who's going to come along and want to say that we do have freedom of the will in the that very strong sense, is going to have to explain why that doesn't involve an infinite regress. Okay, but leaving that aside, so Locke's answer is no. It's not the will itself that determines which operation the will is going to carry out. So what is it? Or to put it, and this also, Locke puts it this way, although this also is a little bit of a loose way of speaking, you could say, what determines the will? That is, what decides which of the operations that are due to the power of willing my mind is actually going to carry out? And Locke's answer is pleasure and pain. So let me switch back to the document camera. This is on page 232. Oops. Again, buried very far into this discussion. This is book 2, chapter 21 still, but it's section 29. And he says, this is where he finally explains how he thinks our will actually is determined to prefer one thing over another. And this is what he says. And to this I answer, the motive for continuing in the same state or action is only the present satisfaction in it. The motive to change is always some uneasiness, nothing setting us upon the change of state or upon any new action, but some uneasiness. This is the great motive. Motive means, it's like motor. Motive means something that moves you, right? This is what moves the will. This is the move means, like, generally speaking, motion is about the change from potentiality to actuality, right? That is from power to operation. So so he's using motive actually. I mean, it's the narrow case of the use of motive where we normally use it, but he's actually using in the broad technical sense of motive, something that moves something. This is the great motive that works on the mind to put it upon action, which for shortness' sake we will call determining of the will, which I shall more at large explain. So more at large explain, actually, he goes on and on about this, about some kind of relatively obscure question about the roles of pleasure versus pain. The main point is here that Locke says, what is it that determines which I'll prefer? Pleasure and pain, satisfaction and uneasiness. Remember that he says that those are synonyms, right? That when he says pleasure, he means all kinds of satisfaction or gratification or whatever. And when he says pain, he means any kind of uneasiness. Wait, I have completely the wrong notes here. I just have to keep using the ones on my screen. I don't know what happened down at the printer. Okay, so this is Locke's full view on freedom of will. We don't have freedom of will. The will basically is a passive power, just like perception. It's moved by something else. What is it moved by? By whatever causes us to perceive the ideas of pleasure and pain. Okay, are there questions about any of that? Okay, because now, following my list that I erased, but it's still in my head, after freedom of will, I'm going to discuss morality. So morality or ethics. Various philosophers, including Hegel and Bernard Williams and probably others, have made a big deal about the distinction between morality and ethics. But originally, morality and ethics are just translation equivalents. Ethics is Greek and morality is Latin. So I don't believe Locke makes any distinction, and most philosophers don't make a distinction between them. So, okay, so what are we talking about here when we talk about morality or ethics? Well, I guess I should start with this. So, the doctrine I just ascribed to Locke is what's nowadays sometimes called psychological hedonism. That is the doctrine that no matter what, we always prefer pleasure and avoid pain. And remember, Locke already said that a long time ago when he was discussing practical principles. And he said, we have no practical principles, strictly speaking, that is propositions, innate propositions according to which we decide what to do. But there are practical principles in the sense that there's this principle that we always seek pleasure and avoid pain. And that is innate. You might want to say it's not only innate, but it's by definition of pleasure and pain. Of course, Locke can't say that because Locke says that pleasure and pain are simple ideas, so they don't have a definition. But perhaps this is another case where we can see in the simple idea a necessary connection to something else, right? So that is, perhaps this is another case of what Kant would call synthetic a priori in Locke. In any case, be that as it may, reason people call this psychological hedonism is because they want to distinguish it from ethical hedonism or moral hedonism, which is the doctrine that it's good to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So the truth is that not only are these not the same, but they don't even go together that well, right? Like if you think that we always, no matter what, seek pleasure and avoid pain, then that's not really a good definition of good because, I mean, it's fun because it means that we're always good. Everything, we always make the right choice because, but right by definition means to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and we always do that. But it also means that the whole distinction between good and evil doesn't seem to be doing anything here. Um, so, um, so in other words, these actually, you might think that you have to choose one of them or the other. Um, However, Locke does say, and he's following not only Epicurus, but also maybe more relevantly Hobbes when he says this, that the word good just means pleasure or what gets us pleasure, right? So when we call something good, we either mean that we derive pleasure from it, or we mean that we can use it to do something or obtain something from which we'll derive pleasure. So it's not just equivalent to pleasure. I guess that's important. Maybe even if we stopped here, this might not be exactly what you mean by ethical hedonism. Again, it depends. There's different things you could mean by that. Um, but um, but in any case, that seems to involve Locke in the problem I was just talking about, right? Doesn't that mean that there's no question of whether human actions or human preferences, so there's no question of whether human preferences are good or evil because they're always good. We always prefer the good, that is the pleasant, or what gets the pleasant. And number two, it also would mean that human actions are always good insofar as they're voluntary, right? So that if we ever do something bad, that is something that gets us pain, it would have to be involuntarily. And so we don't ever do anything bad that's our fault, right? So in other words, again, putting these two things together would seem to make the distinction between good and evil superfluous. But Locke doesn't stop with just that. And the way he gets around that problem is that he introduces a special type of good called moral good. And this is what he says when he first starts discussing moral relations in chapter 28. This is on page 316. So let me switch back to the document camera. Share. Document camera. Right, so good and evil, oops, as hath been shown, are nothing but pleasure or pain, or that which occasions or procures pleasure or pain in us. So, so far, that's just what I said. And now here he is introducing the special type of good or evil that he calls moral good or evil. So it's a special type of good or evil. That means it's still a kind of pleasure or pain, or something that procures pleasure or pain. That is, it still falls under the general definition of good, but it's a special way of procuring pleasure or pain. Morally good and evil, then, is only the conformity or disagreement of our voluntary actions to some law, whereby good or evil is drawn on us from the will and power of the lawmaker. Which good and evil, pleasure or pain, attending our observance or breach of the law by the decree of the lawmaker, is that we call reward and punishment. Right? So moral good and moral evil are, oops, let me switch back to the board. I always make this mistake. So moral good and evil are things that, I guess it's actions. Uh, actions that get us pain or pleasure due to the will of a lawgiver. That's the definition of moral good and evil, according to Locke. So why is this discussed in the chapter about other relations? Because this means that whether something is morally good or evil, oh, I see something in the chat window. Okay, so there have been two questions that I'm asked. The first one is, how does he reconcile that sometimes pain is necessary for improvement? Exercise, for instance, or self-control, right? Um, so the point is sometimes it gets in under this heading, right? I think that sometimes a lesser pain can be considered a good insofar as it we expect that it will procure us a greater pleasure in the long run. This is already what, Epicurus, I mean, any like real philosophical ethical hedonists always say something like that, right? They don't say that the good thing is to do whatever causes you the most pleasure right now. Um, Except maybe Diogenes the Cynic, I'm not sure. But anyway, mostly they don't say that. If they're like Epicurus, they say, no, what you have to do is seek the greatest pleasure over the length of your life. And that means that actually, despite what we use Epicurean to mean right now, nowadays, what Epicurus actually advises is that you lead a very moderate and calm and peaceful life, and that will maximize your pleasure in the long run. So, right, so it's the same thing Locke is going to say that although something is considered by itself an evil, when we think about the great pleasure that we're going to get from it in the long run, we can, from that point of view, we can call it a good. So that was answering the first question. If someone thought their greatest pleasure is to fulfill their desires despite it hurting others, can it be considered good? Well, so far, we're not talking about others here, right? That is, good is a name for pleasure. So when I say good, Locke, I mean, Hobbes is actually a lot more explicit about this than Locke is. But I think Locke is following Hobbes here. When I say good, I mean, whose pleasure? My pleasure, right? I don't mean pleasure somewhere else. Right? So yes, sure enough, if I can maximize my pleasure in the long run by hurting everyone else, then from my point of view, hurting everyone else is good. That's the exact problem that, okay, so that's the exact problem actually that lawgivers are going to come in to solve, right? In Hobbes and Locke. Um, so, but okay, so not dealing with that yet though. I mean, so actually, so that's a way in which the terms good and evil in general are relative, are relations, right? When I say something is good, I really mean it's good for me. Um, so, like when, so like the two of us aren't arguing with each other when I say this is good and you say no, it's evil, because I mean it's good for me and you mean it's evil for you, and those don't contradict each other. So that's like a sign that there's a hidden relation, right? But leaving that aside, when we get to moral good and evil, there's another hidden relation. Namely, since when I call something morally good or evil, when I call an action morally good or evil, I mean that it tends to procure pain or pleasure for me due to the will of a lawgiver who has established a law which that action either conforms to or violates. Therefore, the question of whether a particular action is morally good or morally evil or neither depends which lawgiver, or in other words, which law I'm talking about. So, this is a form of what's called moral relativism, right? That is, as you should take a clue from the fact that Locke discusses his view of morality in a chapter called Other Relations. He's a moral relativist. He says that the question of whether something is good and evil can't be good or evil can't be answered just straight. You have to tell me which law you're thinking of comparing the action to, and then I can tell you whether it's morally good or morally evil or neither. Right? And by the way, according to this definition, it could well be neither, right? It could be something that will procure me neither pain nor pleasure due to the will of the lawgiver. And when he discusses the law of opinion, which he says, when we compare actions to the law of opinion to determine whether they're morally good or evil compared to that law, it's based on that we label them virtuous or vicious. So when he discusses that, the law of opinion means the law of opinion of those with whom I associate. So when I ask whether something is morally good or evil in that sense, when I ask whether it's virtuous or vicious, I'm comparing it, I'm asking relative to the people with whom I associate. And so with respect to that law in particular, Locke is a very familiar kind of moral relativist. That is, he's a cultural moral relativist, as we would say it, or anything, anyway, something very close to that. He says that, what is morally good or evil in that sense? What is virtuous or what is vicious? What is a virtue or what is a vice? Depends on what culture, or perhaps smaller than what we usually call a culture, like what subculture, what group of associates is um, I'm worried about the opinion of, right? So if I live in a certain kind of whatever upper middle class society in America in this year, I'm worried about the opinion of those people, the people who are members of that group. And when I ask whether an action is a virtue or a vice, I mean, do those people approve of it or not? But if I want to know whether that same action is a virtue or a vice in ancient Greece or in a different socioeconomic group in America now or in 17th century England or whatever, I'm literally asking a different question because it's a different group of people I'm asking whether they approve of it or not. Right? And that, as I said, is basically what we call cultural moral relativism, or something very close to it. So why doesn't Locke just end up, plain and simple, a cultural moral relativist? Well, because they're actually, he discusses three different, and it's really three different kinds of law that you can fit into the relation slot here. Right? So what we're saying when we say that good or evil is relative to law or to lawgiver. I mean, I guess, those aren't exactly the same thing. The same lawgiver could give more than one law. Maybe then we're thinking of them as two different lawgivers. I'm not going to get into that. So I'm just going to say for short that it's relative to law. So we're saying, like, when we say action X is good, there's like a silent part that we're leaving out. Relative to law blank. Right? And, maybe that's usually understood from context or whatever, but if we can forget that and start to think that you don't have to specify a law to ask this question, and then we would make mistakes, because this relation is really there. Just like if you said X is big, and you forgot that means big relative to something, to what's normal for that type of thing or whatever, you can get into all kinds of paradoxes, like saying that this is a small mountain and this is a big tree, but the big tree is smaller than the small mountain. How can that be, etc. Right? So the same kind of problems would happen here. So, but to this blank, Locke says there's three different kinds of law we could fill in. I'm going to write these in the opposite order that Locke usually states them. So one is what I just mentioned, the law of opinion. So the lawgiver, in the case of the law of opinion, is the group of people I'm associated with. And the way they give me pleasure or pain, depending on whether I conform with their law or not, is by approving or disapproving of me. And Locke says, if you don't think that disapproval by your associates is a really serious punishment, you don't know much about human nature. In a sense, he says this is actually the law that binds people most strictly most of the time. They rarely forget about this. But there are these other two types of law. So one is called the civil law. That's the only other type. Well, maybe that's not true. Locke thinks anyway that that's the only other type that Hobbes introduces. Um, so, right, the civil law, it's pretty clear what this is. It's what we usually call law most of the time, right? The lawgiver is what Locke calls the commonwealth, or, we might call the state, meaning, whatever is the legislative authority in that state. If you want to know what Locke thinks about that, again, you could read the second treatise on government, and you could take 144 next year. But so anyway, somehow the state or the commonwealth establishes a law. It's the lawgiver, and the pain or pleasure it that I hope to procure or avoid, or like hope or fear to procure by obeying or violating this law, is criminal penalties and rewards. It's a little bit of a problem with this whole way of thinking about things. It's strange that states don't seem to use rewards that much compared to penalties. They do, it does use it a little bit, but it has to be explained, right? So in any case, right, whereas like this one uses both all the time, approval and disapproval. But so in any case, that's the civil law. This also, there's many types of laws of opinion depending on which association of people we're talking about. There's also many different types of civil law depending on which state we're talking about. So it may be more or less clear which one applies. In both of these cases, it may be more or less clear which one applies to any individual at a particular time, although there will be cases where it's not clear. But in any case, over time and space, we don't get any uniform answer to what is good and evil out of these. But that's where the third one comes in, which Locke calls divine law, or natural law, or the law of reason. He uses these two expressions more in the second treatise on government. I think he uses them here sometimes. I don't remember. But in any case, these are all the same thing. Here, the lawgiver is God, and the reward and punishment are, mostly in the afterlife, right? So the reward or punishment that God is going to give for conforming to or violating the divine law, respectively, is infinite pleasure or infinite pain in the afterlife. And now you can see, leaving aside a lot of questions that brings up, like how do we know that there is a God, and how do we know if there is a God that that's the law that God is going to enforce, and etc., right? We can see how if there is a law like this, you should always follow this one. Now, what do I mean by should? What I mean is that if you have your wits about you, if you follow your reason, you will always follow this one, because what is infinite pain, the infinite power to reward or punish, that includes in itself both and these are metaphorical according to Locke. They have to somehow be tied to questions of quantity, but leaving that aside, it includes both the infinity of the pleasure or pain that's available and the infinite accuracy with which it will be imposed, right? So like this law in particular, Locke says that although people find it very impressive, nevertheless, they often violate it because they flatter themselves that they'll get away with it, right? So they know that the state has a very great power to reward or punish them, but they think maybe I won't get caught. Um, but if the divine lawgiver has not only infinite power to reward and punish, but also infinite accuracy, so knows perfectly well who's been naughty and who's been nice, then I can't expect to escape this. And I know that these rewards and punishments will outweigh any other motive that I may have. In particular, they'll outweigh the rewards and punishments of these other laws. So therefore, if I'm thinking straight, I will obey this law. And if I'm not, it's my fault. Okay. Are there questions about that? Because, oh boy, it really looks like I'm not going to get to some of those things lower on the list, but oh well, what else is new? Maybe I'll have time to talk about them next time. All right, so as far as how do we know that there is a God, Locke is going to address that question later on. So I'm going to leave that aside for now. Although, as we'll see when we see the answer to that question, there may be some problem figuring out whether he's proved the right thing for his purposes here. In any case, be that as it may, let's take it for granted that there is a God, and that God has this infinite power and accuracy of reward and punishment. So notice that all we need here is Locke's idea of infinity to make sense of that, right? That is, we don't need to know an actual infinite amount of pleasure or pain, or an actual infinite degree of accuracy to have a clear and distinct idea of that. All we have to know is choose any other degree of pleasure and pain, power to reward and punish, and accuracy of reward and punishment, and God's is better, right? God has more. That's Locke's idea of infinity, and it's exactly the only idea that he needs here. As long as I can say that, then I know that I ought to follow this law, the divine law. But the question is, okay, hey, so how do we know what the divine law is? That now has become a really serious question. In a sense, it's become the most important question that you could possibly ask, right? Because everything is at stake. If I want to know what I should do right now rationally, I better be able to answer that question. So you might think, given how often Locke quotes the Bible, that the answer is going to be, look in the Bible. There you'll see what divine law is. That would not be a very good answer, because it would mean that people who don't have the Bible, right, like people it was not revealed to. So people who before the Bible existed, or who were in America, or whatever, never heard of it, the divine law wouldn't be binding on them, because not knowing it, they couldn't try to conform to it or avoid it, and therefore they wouldn't be liable to reward or punishment. At least that's a common sense view about reward and punishment, and it's one that Locke explicitly maintains himself. So as a result, I think, as a result, you can gather from that, if from nothing else, that every time Locke quotes the Bible to establish a point of ethics, or for that matter, anything at all, really, it's always just a corroborating witness, basically. There has to be an argument from reason that will compel you to believe something. He never, um, I mean, he doesn't write, I don't know what he says in his book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. I should read that sometime. It's a late book that he wrote. Um, but in his main works, he never talks about the mysteries of the faith, like Trinity and incarnation. I don't know exactly what he says about those, but for all the normal things he talks about, metaphysics and ethics and whatever, when he quotes the Bible, it's always just to corroborate the conclusions of reason. So how can we know by reason what the divine law is? That is, what laws there are that God would want us to obey such that God would bring this infinite power of order and punishment to bear to motivate us to obey them. So the answer, I think, and we should keep this in mind for when we read Hume's Ethics at the end of the quarter, that the answer basically is that we know that what God would want is what's good for human beings as a whole, the public utility. Or at least these are not exactly the same, and I'm not sure which Locke means, actually. At least the good of the whole society that I'm in. I'm running out of time, so I won't be able to say, like, I would like to show you quotes that show that Locke is thinking this, but instead let me just assert a couple of things about this. Um, so basically, Locke says we can know that God would have established a law and established infinite rewards and punishments to back it up, because we know that God has the wisdom and goodness to require us to do what is best. Now that seems at first circular, right? Like, isn't what is best, that is what is morally good, just defined by what God's law is? But I think if you look carefully, you'll see what he means is that God has evidently made human beings to be social creatures. So, and perhaps this is just empirical, or perhaps not. Maybe it has something to do with the nature of rationality. But in any case, we evidently are social creatures, and God's will in creating us evidently is the good of the whole of the society. So therefore, what the divine law commands is always what's good for the whole, not necessarily what I call good, that is my own pleasure and pain, but what everyone together could agree was good. And this is why I need an external motive to get me to seek it, because on my own, all I would seek is my own good or evil, that is my own pleasure or pain. But what God wants me to do, God wants to align my will with the general will, with the universal will of the society, at least, or maybe of all rational beings or something. Anyway, so God wants to align my individual will with the universal will. And the only way to do that is to say, whatever individual pleasure or pain you think you can get out of doing what's bad for society, I'm going to outweigh that with my punishment, which will be greater than that. Okay, so I'm out of time. That's all I have to say, but I hope at least to talk about personal identity and maybe those other things next time. I don't know. I will see you then.